In the autumn of 1978, a young woman named Della Morse stood in the dusty air of the Green Mountain County auction barn, a place that smelled of hay, old wood, and the bitter sweat of financial desperation. She was 26 years old, and she looked as out of place among the weathered, thick-handed sheep farmers as a wildflower in a field of stone. They were men carved from the unforgiving Vermont landscape, their faces maps of hard winters and lean springs. Della, by contrast, seemed too slight, too quiet, her hands those of a scholar, not a farmer. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, a satchel that contained the entirety of her inheritance that wasn't land, the notebooks of her grandfather, Arthur Morse. Let me tell you about that day. The air was thick with the low murmur of men who had known each other for generations, their conversations a shorthand of crop prices, weather predictions, and the quiet ruin of their neighbors. They were there to bid on livestock, on machinery, on the parceled-out remnants of farms that had finally surrendered to debt or exhaustion. Della was not there for a tractor or a flock of Dorset sheep. She was waiting for Lot 73. When the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson whose voice could cut through the noise of a stampede, finally called it, a ripple of amusement went through the crowd. "All right, gentlemen, next up we have Lot 73. A bit of an unusual one for us today. 31 head of alpaca. Yes, you heard me right. Alpaca." He said the word as if it were a joke, a foreign curiosity. And then the animals were led into the viewing pen. They were a sorry sight. A motley crew of tangled fleece, thin bodies, and weary, oversized eyes. They huddled together, a knot of brown, black, and fawn, their coats matted with burrs and mud. They looked defeated, like a forgotten idea. A low chuckle rumbled through the assembled farmers. One man, Silas Thorne, the largest sheep rancher in 3 counties and a man who considered conventional wisdom to be gospel, leaned over to his neighbor. His voice, meant to be a stage whisper, carried easily. "Look at that. Someone's failed South American experiment. Not enough meat on 'em to make a decent stew, and that fleece looks like floor sweepings." Henderson, sensing the room, tried to build some momentum. Now, a little grooming, and these animals could be something. We'll start the bidding at $100 a head. That's $3,100 for the lot. Who'll give me $3,100? He was met with absolute, deafening silence. The only sound was the shuffling of the alpacas' soft feet on the dusty floor of the pen. The farmers looked at each other, some with smirks, others with a kind of pity for the animals themselves. $3,100 for 31 problems. That was the consensus. Henderson wiped his brow. 3,100, a bargain for an instant herd. Do I hear 30? 28? The silence held, thick and immovable. It was the silence of a foregone conclusion. These animals were worthless. Then, let me explain the strategy of a quiet mind. Della did not move. She did not raise a hand. She had read her grandfather's notes on auctions. "Let the silence do the work," he had written. "Men who talk are trying to convince themselves. A man who is certain has no need for words." Della stood in her certainty, her stillness a stark contrast to the auctioneer's frantic energy. Henderson's voice grew strained. "All right, let's get these moved. Someone give me an offer. $2,500 for the whole lot. $2,500, and you can haul 'em home today. It's practically a giveaway." It was then, into that void of derision and disinterest, that a clear, calm voice spoke. $2,500. Every head in the barn turned. The voice was Della's. It was not loud, but it was unwavering. The farmers stared at her, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. Arthur Morse's granddaughter, the girl who just buried the old man, buying these things. Silas Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like a stone cracking. He shook his head, a gesture of pure condescension. The girl's lost her mind. Grief does strange things. Henderson's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in relief. He didn't waste a second. I have 2,500. Do I hear 26? 2,500 once. Twice. Sold to the young lady in the back for $2,500. The gavel cracked like a gunshot, and the deal was done. The murmuring that followed was not of admiration, but of pity. Della Morse, the orphan inheritor of 3,000 acres of highland pasture, had just spent the last of her liquid cash on a herd of walking jokes. She had, in the eyes of every seasoned expert in that room, made her first and final mistake. Now, you have to understand the world she had just entered. In 1978, Vermont farming was about volume and efficiency. It was about dairy cows that gave the most milk and sheep that produced the heaviest fleece, all of it propped up by mountains of grain, supplements, and chemical fertilizers. The land was not a partner. It was a resource to be exploited, its output measured and maximized on a ledger sheet. Debt was a constant companion, a low-grade fever that every farmer ran. You borrowed against next year's crop to pay for this year's feed. It was the only way, they said. It was modern agriculture. Della's grandfather, Arthur Morse, had been an outlier, a man who operated on a different clock. He was respected for his integrity but regarded as an eccentric, a fossil from a bygone era. He never took a loan he couldn't repay in a single season. He let fields lie fallow for years at a time, a practice his neighbors considered a mortal sin against productivity. While they were buying bigger tractors and more complex chemical compounds, Arthur was walking his land, a soil auger in one hand and a notebook in the other. He was listening to the earth, and what he left Della was not a thriving modern operation. He left her the land itself, free and clear of any debt, and the leather-bound notebooks. There were 27 of them, spanning 50 years of his life on that farm. They were not simple journals. They were scientific documents, philosophical treatises, and love letters to a piece of the earth. In them, Arthur had recorded everything. Decades of rainfall totals, measured in a simple gauge on a fence post. The first frost and last thaw of every year since 1928. He had sketched the root systems of native grasses, timothy, fescue, wild clover, and noted which ones thrived in the acidic, rocky soil of the highlands. He cataloged the insects, the birds, the very breath of the seasons. It was in the last 3 notebooks, the ones from his final years, that Della found the alpacas. Her grandfather had become fascinated with them, not as a get-rich-quick scheme, but as a piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire life, how to farm in partnership with his specific, stubborn piece of Vermont. He had traveled, studied, and observed small herds. He wrote, "The sheep, with their sharp hooves, compact the soil. They are conquerors of the pasture. The alpaca, with its soft pads, walks like a guest. It does not demand, it accepts." Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever believed in an idea so completely that the laughter of others sounds like a distant static? That was Della. The men in the auction barn saw 31 scruffy, worthless animals. But Della, armed with her grandfather's meticulous research, saw something else entirely. She saw the key. Her grandfather's core theory was a form of agricultural heresy. The experts, the university studies, the feed salesmen, they all said that to produce high-quality fiber, an animal needed a high-protein diet. Corn, soy, expensive supplements. Arthur Morse believed this was fundamentally wrong, at least for alpacas in this specific environment. He wrote, "We are forcing the land to be something it is not. We pour grain into these animals to produce a fat, quick fleece, but it is a lazy fleece. It lacks character. It has no memory of the hardship that makes things strong. He hypothesized that the unique blend of tough, native highland grasses of his farm, the very grasses the sheep farmers ignored in favor of cultivated alfalfa, would force the alpacas' bodies to produce a fiber of extraordinary resilience and fineness. The stress, he believed, was the secret. The slight malnutrition of a Vermont winter, the need to seek out specific mineral-rich weeds, these were not problems to be solved with a sack of grain, but ingredients in a recipe. The animals would be leaner, yes. They might look scruffier to the untrained eye. But their fleece, he predicted, would possess a quality that could not be bought from a feed store. It would be a direct translation of the land itself. So when Della brought her 31 alpacas home in a borrowed, rickety stock trailer, she wasn't just bringing home livestock. She was beginning an experiment 50 years in the making. She backed the trailer up to the gate of a pasture her grandfather had named North Rest, a field that hadn't seen a grazing animal in 7 years. The grass was waist-high, a complex tapestry of greens and browns. The other farmers would have plowed it under and planted alfalfa. Della opened the gate. The alpacas hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, stepped out onto the land that had been waiting for them. They did not rush to eat. They moved slowly, their long necks dipping down to investigate, to taste, to select. Della watched, her heart pounding. It was one thing to read it in a book. It was another to wager your entire future on it. She stood there until dusk, watching them graze, not with the voracious appetite of a sheep, but with the careful deliberation of a connoisseur. They were already proving him right. The subsequent years were a masterclass in patience. Della lived a solitary life, governed by the seasons and the wisdom in those notebooks. She divided the 3,000 acres into dozens of pastures, rotating the herd according to a complex schedule her grandfather had devised. They never grazed on a pasture for more than a few weeks, and a pasture was never grazed more than once a year. The rest of the time, the land was left to recover, to grow, to deepen its roots. The local farmers driving by would see vast fields of uncut grass and shake their heads. Morse's folly, they called it. Letting good land go to waste. The whispers followed her into town. At the general store, Silas Thorne would nod curtly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and smugness. "Heard you lost one of those llamas to the winter," he'd say, intentionally using the wrong name for the animal. "Tough animals to keep if you don't feed 'em right." Della would simply nod and reply, "It was an old one. It was his time." She never argued. She never explained. Her grandfather had written, "Never waste your breath trying to convince a man who profits from your failure." There was a moment of private doubt. It came in the third winter, a brutal season of deep snow and wind that howled like a hungry wolf. The alpacas were huddled in the simple 3-sided shelter she had built for them, their coats thick with ice. One of the younger females, a cria born the previous spring, was weak, shivering, and refusing to eat the hay Della had harvested by hand. Every instinct screamed at her to drive into town and buy a bag of high-protein grain. It would be an admission of defeat, a betrayal of the entire experiment, but the animal might die if she didn't. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, she opened her grandfather's notebook for that corresponding year, 1943. He had described a similarly harsh winter. "The snow is a heavy blanket," he wrote. "The herd is tested. It is tempting to intervene, to play God with a feed bag. But the weakness must be culled. The strong must learn to endure. This is the land's way. It is a cruel kindness, but it is a kindness nonetheless. The herd that survives this will be a herd of iron." Della closed the book. She went out to the shelter, sat with the shivering cria, and simply waited. The animal died before dawn. Della buried it on a windswept hill, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She had not failed. She had passed a test. She had chosen the hard path, the long one. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first signs of success began to appear. The pastures, under her patient rotation, were transforming. The native grasses, no longer choked out by aggressive, cultivated species, grew thicker and more diverse. The soil, which had been hard and compacted, became dark and friable, rich with worms. The land was waking up. The alpacas, too, were changing. The original 31, lean and hardy, had begun to breed. Their offspring, born and raised solely on the native forage, were different. They were calm, resilient, and their fleece, even to Della's untrained eye, felt different. It was denser, softer, with a kind of life to it that she hadn't felt before. The first shearing was a modest affair. She hired an old shearer who had worked for her grandfather. He grumbled about the animals, about their tangled coats. But when he was done, and the fleece lay in piles on the clean-swept barn floor, he stopped. He ran a calloused hand through a pile of soft, fawn-colored fiber. "Huh," he grunted. "Not as bad as it looks on the hoof." Got some good crimp to it. It was the first compliment Della had received in 4 years. She sold that small clip for a pittance to a local spinner, just enough to cover her property taxes. But it was a start. It was proof of concept. For 6 more years, the cycle continued. Della and her herd lived in quiet harmony with the land. The herd grew, slowly, naturally, to nearly 100 animals. Each year, the fleece she sheared was a little better, a little finer. She learned to skirt and grade it herself, following the detailed diagrams in Arthur's notebooks. She sold her small lots to specialty spinners and weavers, building a reputation not for volume, but for a peculiar kind of quality, a fiber that told a story. She remained a curiosity, the alpaca lady, a harmless eccentric. The farmers still whispered, but the outright laughter had faded, replaced by a kind of stubborn, head-shaking puzzlement. She wasn't getting rich, but she wasn't failing either. She was simply persisting. Then, in the mid-1980s, the world began to change. Let me tell you, big changes often start as small whispers in faraway places. A fashion designer in Paris championed natural fibers. A consumer movement in California began demanding sustainable, petroleum-free textiles. The price of oil, which had been climbing for years, spiked again, and with it, the cost of everything made from it, fertilizers, pesticides, and the fuel needed to transport grain. Suddenly, the entire economic equation of American agriculture was thrown into chaos. For the sheep farmers of Green Mountain County, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. The price of wool shot to a 20-year high, which should have been a windfall. But the price of grain, the very foundation of their operations, rose even faster. Their margins, already thin, evaporated. Then they were inverted. It was costing them more to feed a sheep than they could ever hope to earn from its fleece. Men like Silas Thorne, who had built empires on the principle of high-input, high-output farming, were trapped. They had huge flocks that demanded huge amounts of feed. They were leveraged to the hilt with the banks. Their system, which had seemed so robust and modern, was revealed to be a fragile house of cards. And Della? Her cost of production was the same as it had been 10 years earlier. The cost of her own labor, the price of gasoline for her old truck, and her property taxes. Her feed was the grass that grew freely on the hillsides. Her fertilizer was the manure her herd left behind. Her pesticide was a healthy, balanced ecosystem. When the wool buyers came calling that year, their faces grim with the news of rising prices and collapsing supply, they came to Morse Farm. Della had her clip laid out in the barn. It was the largest she had ever produced, over 500 pounds of exquisitely fine, clean fiber. A buyer from a high-end Boston textile mill, a man accustomed to dealing with the best fiber in the world, ran his hands through it. He picked up a lock, held it to the light, and was silent for a long moment. He pulled a micrometer from his pocket and measured the fiber diameter. He looked at the reading, then looked at Della, his eyes wide with a professional's awe. "Miss Morse," he said, his voice hushed. "Where on earth did this come from? The fineness, the staple length, the consistency, it's unlike anything I've seen from this region. What are you feeding these animals?" Della looked out the barn door at the green hills, at her herd grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Vermont," she said. The price he offered her was astronomical. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than her grandfather had likely earned in his final decade. It was enough to live on for 5 years. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of a long-held belief finally proven, that next year's clip would be even better. The land was only getting healthier. Vindication, when it came, did not arrive with a trumpet blast. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in a dusty pickup truck. Silas Thorne drove up her long, winding driveway, something he had not done in a decade. He was an older man now, his shoulders stooped, the arrogance in his eyes replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. He got out of his truck and stood for a moment, just looking. He looked at the healthy, thriving herd, at the lush, green pastures stretching into the distance. He looked at the simple, well-maintained barn and the small, neat farmhouse, all of it standing free and clear, unburdened by the weight of a mortgage. Della came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She did not smile. She simply waited. "Della," he said, his voice rough. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "I had to sell off half my flock last week. Couldn't afford the feed bill. The bank is calling my notes. I don't know if I'm going to make it through the winter." Della remained silent. She let him speak. "All these years," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the landscape, at the alpacas, "we all thought you were crazy. A sentimental girl playing at farming. We laughed. I laughed the loudest." He looked at her directly then, and she saw in his eyes the terrible clarity of a man who has lost everything. "We were wrong. You and that old man. You were right all along." "How? How did you know?" For the first time, Della allowed herself a small, sad smile. She went back inside and returned with one of her grandfather's notebooks, its leather cover softened with age. She opened it to a page filled with his elegant, spidery script. "He believed the land would tell you what it needed, if you were quiet enough to listen," she said, her voice soft. "He said that debt makes a man deaf. We never borrowed a dime." Silas Thorne stared at the notebook, at the decades of patient observation recorded on the page. He saw not just numbers and notes, but a philosophy, a way of being that he had dismissed as foolish and old-fashioned. He finally understood. They had been in a race, and he had just realized Della was running on an entirely different course, one that led not to a finish line, but to sustainability, to permanence. He nodded slowly, a deep, profound acknowledgement of his own failure. "He was a better farmer than any of us," Thorne said, his voice cracking. "And so are you. Lay." He put his hat back on, got in his truck, and drove away, a man broken by the very system he had championed. Let me tell you what happened after that. The story of Della Morse and her alpacas became a quiet legend in those mountains. She never grew into a massive operation. She never took on investors or tried to conquer the market. She kept her herd at a size the land could comfortably support, and no larger. She became a pillar of a new kind of agriculture in the state, one based on low inputs, native species, and deep ecological knowledge. Young farmers, tired of the cycle of debt and despair, began to seek her out. She would welcome them into her small kitchen, the scent of baking bread in the air, and she would bring out the notebooks. She would show them her grandfather's rainfall charts, his soil maps, his observations on the grazing patterns of her herd. She wasn't just teaching them how to raise alpacas. She was teaching them how to see the land, how to listen to it. She was passing on the legacy. Decades passed. Della grew into an elder herself, her face etched with the same kind of wisdom that had been in her grandfather's. Her hands, once soft, were now as capable and calloused as any of the men who had once laughed at her. She was a woman who had built a life, not by conquering the land, but by entering into a partnership with it. The men at the auction had seen 31 scruffy animals and a foolish girl. They saw a bad investment, a deviation from the proven path. But her grandfather had taught her to look deeper. He taught her to see the hidden potential, to understand that the greatest strength often comes from enduring hardship, not from avoiding it. The farmers measured their success in tons of grain and gallons of milk. Della, and the land itself, measured it in cycles of renewal, in the quiet health of the soil, in the resilience of a herd that knew how to live in its own place. They all said she would fail. But in the end, the land remembered its friends, and the numbers, written not just in ledgers but in the very fiber of the wool she sold, told the truest story of all.